Welcome to American Building. I'm your host, Atif Kader. Join me as we explore the skylines and strip malls, the crosswalks and rail crossings, the balconies, the buildings, and the boroughs shaping the next generation of real estate. Let's build common ground. 4 years ago, we sat down with architect and urbanist Vishaan Chakrabarti to explore his vision for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame expansion in Cleveland, then still on the drawing boards. Today, that project is under construction, reshaping Cleveland's lakefront with a bold new cultural landmark. As cranes rise and the tower takes form, our conversation with Vishaan feels more timely than ever. It's a front row seat to how great design can catalyze civic life and spur economic vitality. In this re-release of parts 1 and 2, we revisit Vishaan's insights on adaptive reuse, public-private partnerships, and the power of storytelling through architecture. You'll hear about the challenges he faced, from site constraints to community engagement, and the innovative solutions that laid the groundwork for today's groundbreaking construction. Whether you're a developer, policymaker, or design enthusiast, this two-part conversation offers a rare glimpse into the making of a landmark in motion and where the future of urban creativity may go next. Enjoy.
At the same time, we were trying to restore the original building. A lot happened to the original building over the course of its history, in part because it was dysfunctional, in part because things like energy code came along and people had to put like this film on the building because of the amount of heat gain that the pyramid was getting. Um and then of course the other thing is that late postmodern Platonic geometry is a closed geometry. I mean, this gets into like, well, you're sitting in Michael Graves' house, so I think it's okay. But
It's a big box.
I mean, look, that was a language that was about these closed Platonic forms, right? Triangle, circle, square, and that each of them was completely self-defined
Mhm.
and about themselves as these little objects, and therefore not terribly open to the community. Even the big glass pyramid, it's kind of a little wonky how he designed the front entrance, and things again got changed over
It
time.
doesn't seem like the front entrance. The way you park, walk 3/4 of a circle around to get to the entrance.
Well, the other thing that's really fascinating when you look at the history is Pei designed the building for a different site, and then the site moved, and they basically transplanted the same design to the new site, which is why the plaza never feels right, because the plaza was designed as an outdoor room that was flanked by two buildings in the original site plan. But when the site moved, they moved the plaza, they moved the building, but there were no flanking buildings, and so it never got that sense of an outdoor room.
Mhm.
So that's some of the things that we're trying to bring back with the new design. And so, you know, the other thing about all of this, and you can probably tell the site visit, the understanding the history, is we're a deeply fact-based firm that needs we have a process that we call place, needs, and connection, where we Diana Agris used to say that you have to read a place before you write it. I'm sure she still does. So you have to read a place before you write in it. And so, understanding the full breadth of the history, the community narrative, what is this place
Mhm.
for this place? Before you start setting pen to paper, then you understand needs. What are the community's current and future needs of the place? What are the client's needs? What are the budgetary needs, the schedule needs? And then how, with that understanding of place and needs, do you form emotional and spiritual connection with new architecture?
Mhm.
And out of that forms our sort of motto, which is place needs connection, that places like Cleveland, places like Detroit, especially because of the automobile, because of racial segregation, because of environmental injustices, were carved up and purposefully made to be disconnected. The highway that separates you from that community, right? And so, um, we start as archaeologists and end as seamstresses, right? Like, we start in a deep, deep dive into what a place is and try to unearth all of these facts. Oh my god, the building was designed for a different site, right? Like,
That's unreal.
we try to unearth all of these things like an archaeologist would. And then understand that, with the architecture, it's an act of sewing. We are reconnecting. We are seamstresses, right? And so we then take that archaeological knowledge and say, okay, how do we sew this quilt back together again? We found all these pieces. How did our piece form like the missing link in the jigsaw puzzle? Sorry, I'm mixing all these metaphors, but then you sew the quilt together. And so, um, and I think this goes back to what you were saying earlier, that this is, I think, an approach that is new and different and much more. It is, to me, it is the exact opposite of Bilbao, right?
Mhm.
So
Completely.
purposely, which is so purposely creating a segregated object that is Instagram ready.
Mhm.
Um, and look, I'm not trying to diss that era. It's just a different era. It's the late 20th century, and we are now well into the 21st century. You know, we're no longer in that post Cold War irrational exuberance. We are in the post Katrina, post recession, hopefully soon post COVID um, era where architecture and urbanism just plays a different role in our society than simply creating objects and hoping for some economic ripple effect.
I think in particular what you're describing is this difference in perception of what an architect or designer's role is. And I think for previous generations, is the idea that a successful architect was the amazing soloist that everyone would listen to. And now it feels much more like that's a very lame approach. And it's actually much more about the architect being a conductor or organizer or coach of many different things, but that they're not the star themselves. It's actually the team or the orchestra that's the star.
And the thing is, that piece is maybe it's a newer approach, but we should fair is fair. It it goes there's a whole lineage in modern architecture. You know, so there's this lineage that goes from, you know, Frank Lloyd Wright to Korb to Gary, and so forth of that soloist idea. But it's never been true, first of all. I mean, like, right, it's just never been true. But second of all, there's a whole other, you know, Team 10, Aldo Van Eyck, um, you know, Habraken, that you now see like reemerge again in this world of Tatiana Bilbao, of Arvena Abdoshi, uh, and in the United States, we have to play a different game with this. How one does it is very different than these other countries that you spoke to Dahlia and others about, right? But it is possible. And so, I'm excited about this. I mean, so I think it is important to say that yes, it is a sort of newer generation of architecture firms that are approaching communities and cities this way, but it's well embedded in a DNA that was the humanist strand of modernism.
Yeah, and I think that, I have a feeling that a newer generation of architects will vote with their skills and no longer decide that working for a architect firm where the one is the one that stands above everyone else and takes praise for a team's work, they don't have to work there. You don't have to work in a situation that perpetuates that idea. So I hope there are many, many more people in, say, my generation that stood out and said, like, "No, I'm not gonna do that." Just say, "I'm not gonna vote for someone, or I'm not gonna work at a firm where their values don't align with mine."
Yeah, look, I'm a big believer in individual choice, and people should vote with their feet and do work where they want to work. And people have different kind of exigencies in terms of how they work and where they work. But um, I know on our team, we're about 30 people, and the size is great because we're a community. We know each other and trust each other, and from the outset, we had this thing on our website, what we do and what we don't do, and we set apart this kind of stuff that we don't really feel that we should be do and that's not a holier than thou thing, it's just, like, what we don't do, and, I think that's attracted a lot of people, to our office. I think your generation is looking to our generation and saying, "Okay, put up or shut up, tell me how you're really different." Which is look, it's and I wanna be really honest about this. This is not an easy conversation. We still live in a capitalist, paradigm,
Mhm.
right? Like, I've gotta pay everyone. I've gotta we have good benefits. Those are expensive, right? I've gotta make a living. And so for instance, we work with developers who are well-intentioned. Some people think you shouldn't work for developers at all. I think that is maybe not the right line to draw in the sand. I would rather work for an enlightened developer than work for a dictator. And so, when you see people show up in images with Bolsonaro or whatever, I mean, I always find that stuff both predictable and shocking, if that's if that makes any sense.
Welcome to 2021, right?
Yeah, and it's just, so look, we each have our lines and our boundary conditions. Some people have no lines or no boundary conditions whatsoever. And I think for your generation, people are asking this question like, are we really the second oldest profession in the world? Will we really do anyone for anything? Uh, like, I,
Even with the Constitution, right? That's the
yeah, I think there's been a lot. We had it from the outset 6 years ago in our kind of firm manifesto that we would never design correctional facilities. That's now obviously in the aftermath of the murders of George Floyd and, so many others, become a huge deal in the architecture profession. Um, y it's interesting, like, if you've been following New York politics, there's this whole thing about closing Rikers Island.
Mhm.
You close Rikers, you know, there are people who say, "Just don't build any more prisons." There are other people who say, "Look, you need some community-based jails," right? But the problem is you look at the design standards, which I did, and it's like, you still have to have an exposed stainless steel toilet in the center of the cell, um, so the guard can see you. This is not true in many, many countries. And this stripping people, and especially people of color, of basic human dignity, and the fact that an architect draws those things,
Mhm. And specifies the toilet
right?
and skips a
Right? Like, draws the sight lines for the guard. Okay, if that's what y if that's what you wanna do, that's your prerogative. But as you say, the question for young people isn't just architects. So that term, I think, is a dying term, right? But it's not just whether you work for like world famous architects or not. What do you do all day,
Mhm. Yeah.
right? Like, what do you do all day? Now, look, that doesn't mean that you sit in the office and write academic treatises all day. Right? Architecture's hard. And you still have to learn how to draw a toilet partition, and you need to understand ADA, and you need to, like, there are these things that you need to learn if you're gonna be an architect, which is this thing that they say a 28-year-old is an apprentice. And that's not a pejorative. That shouldn't be an insult, but I think some people do take it as a pejorative, unfortunately. It's hard work, but what does it work towards? And I do think people have to make those judgments for themselves. And it's hard in a world of like, I was dean at Berkeley for a year and a half, and 41% of our undergraduate architecture students are first generation college students. A third are underrepresented minority. People have student loans
Mm.
and they have to pay off. This is why I worked very hard to get scholarships to alleviate student loan debt, because loans hamstrung to end up being a real problem for young graduates who have to go work in corporate architecture to pay off their student loans. I worked in corporate architecture to pay off student loans, and um, the academy needs to do a lot more to deal with the debt crisis,
Mhm.
um, in terms of this. So, yeah, I mean, yes, people need to think about their choices. And yes, we all have constraints and exigencies on our choices, right? But even within that context, there's latitude.
Mhm. Yeah. I think that I'm curious about this idea of latitude and the breadth and depth of freedom that you have as a designer in the context of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. What was the brief that you were given, and the way that the way that you thought through that response to get to that bow tie? Actually, let me ask that a different way. I want to adjust this because I want to ask one or two more questions on that. So let's say, um, got it. Okay. So, I want to talk about the freedom that you had in terms of responding to the brief that the owners gave. So, in this context, did you talk through what specifically the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame was looking to accomplish in this renovation, and then the major scope elements that you delivered in response to that?
Um, we're still under a non-disclosure agreement, so there's a limited amount I want to say, but there's an established site. There's an established site that is roughly to the south along the lake. It's the big lawn directly adjacent to the Pay building.
Mhm.
And it's sitting between that lawn sits between the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame and the Great Lakes Science Center,
Mhm.
which also is kind of an object building. It has this old planetarium-like form that's an IMAX theater now. And so, so the site's there, and they needed a number of things: a new lobby, a multi-purpose facility, some debate about performance spaces, new office space, and things that alleviated pressure in the existing building. Uh, but so when you talk about the freedom we had from the brief, so to me, design freedom and architectural freedom is a great topic, and we don't talk about it. So I'm glad you used that word, because to me, it is very different than artistic freedom,
Mhm.
right? I'm a writer. I like to draw. What you do as an artist, and the freedom you have as an artist is very different than the freedoms you have as an architect. Um, Design, of course, requires freedom and free will. At the same time, famously, it is not the sculpting of an object in
Mhm.
space.
Because of
And
building codes, ADA codes, practicality, cost,
goes
time.
back to that place needs connection thing.
Mm.
So if connection is the manifestation of freedom, that freedom is leavened with the qualities of place
Mhm.
and the details of need. And need includes, again, community needs, client needs, code, ADA, all of these things that say, you know, your freedom is constrained, right, by the fact that we have a set of needs. And so therefore it is not just a pure sculpture in space. And so your challenge is to make something, use your freedom, use your talent to create something that is connective, um, leavened by place and needs. So, for example, I have had good, healthy arguments with Pritzker laureate friends who say that they are tired of working in the United States, and in the West more generally, right? And, like to go off and work in the United Arab Emirates or in China because they have freedom. They have freedom to design in a way that you don't here. Um, to which I respond, what kind of colonialist bullshit is that?
Yes.
Um, this is Corb in Algiers all over again. If you look at the history of that plan, of Plan Obus, and there's several versions of it, you know, Corb was a big fan of the colonial project. He loved the French colonial project. He thought it would educate the Arab. There's quotes to that effect. And it is this notion that if you go to these other places, that you can experiment, right? As if the rest of the world is somehow the laboratory uh, for your ideas, because somehow in the Western world, we become smart enough to not let people build things that are either unsafe or don't allow equal access for wheelchairs or don't really respond to community needs, or, whatever list of constraints that people find problematic. This is a debate that we don't have enough of in architecture circles. And this is why we're working in the Rust Belt, in what like a lot of people call flyover country. I've always found that incredibly. I find flyover country as offensive as I find the term heartland, which implies that we on the coast are heartless. But both of we we are the problems we have in our politics today, the rise of fascism all over the world. Architects get to decide whether we're going to be part of the solution or part of the problem.
Yes.
And to me, we're part of the problem if we go serve fascists in other places because they let us, quote, experiment, right? Or we work in the hurly-burly of democracy. And in the hurly-burly of democracy, your show is called American Building. Building in this country is getting more and more complicated for all sorts of reasons. And, our project at Princeton, you know, Princeton is in the middle of an extraordinary reconceiving of itself, of a place that was a kind of epicenter of white privilege, and turning into this place that is really trying to guide its resources to become a place that um, fosters equity and really questions a lot of racial practices, right? And it's very palpable when you're with Princeton to understand that this transformation is taking place. The college we're designing is the replacement college for the college that was named after Woodrow Wilson, now called First College, right? That is now going to be named after Melody Hobson, one of the most prominent African American uh, uh, businesswomen and alumni from Princeton. And so this is a sea change.
Hmm.
And architects get to decide whether they want to be part of that sea change, leaders in that sea change, or taking up the rear guard, right? And longing for the late 1990s. That's the decision before us, and I think that the firms that are succeeding are the ones that are taking on the, the and it's not like, woohoo, we're virtue signaling, we've got the flag. It's incredibly hard. Everything about it's incredibly hard because you're still engaging capitalism. You're still engaging a lot of rules that were written before we got here. But that's the choice.
I think the what you're describing is this idea that architects that choose to focus more on themselves than the people around them essentially draw this caricature of this villainous, arrogant person or this arrogant actor that doesn't necessarily imagine that their work has to be perceived in the context of something else. It's this thing that is delivered upon people, and I think that there is a big generational difference that is going to come very soon. Now that millennials and Gen Z are half the U.S. population, and I think pretty soon will be half of the U.S. electorate as well. Yeah, and I'm look forward to that change.
You're the way you phrase that to me raises this question of what is the role of the self? What is the role of the individual? Because I believe that, architecture is not a science. It is both art and science.
Mhm.
And, if you read Bucky Fuller or you know, look, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame has completely invaded my dreams. Like I dream about the project. I wake up in the middle of the night and I send a sketch to the team at 4 in the morning and
It's not a vocation, it's your calling then if that's what happens.
well, sure, but my point though is that there's still in everything we've said, I'm not trying to obviate the role of design, of an individual's kind of agency in design, and as a firm leader, someone who sure, there is my imprimatur on these things, right? That's not I'm not trying to deny that or deny the strength or the power of that. People hire us with that expectation. Um, it's how that imprimatur it's how heavily it's manifest. Is it bold 48 point type or can it sit there as, 12 point and kind of just live on the strength of the substance of the words rather than the size of the font? And does it provide room? One of the first decisions I made was to not put my name on the front door, and to call the firm something that is somewhat generic, a
Mhm.
practice of architecture and urbanism, but substantively meaningful because that's what we are. We are a practice, and we are focused on architecture and urbanism. And it shortens to POW, which is fun because it's about the desire for impact, right? And exactly. And so I'm not trying to take away that role of someone who wants to sketch and furtively model and, like, it's not some mechanistic thing that can just be taken over by robots someday. But that doesn't mean that it's all about the individual whose name is on the front door.
Mhm.
There's just, there's just a nuance in there that is hard sometimes to kind of well, it's impossible to quantify and hard to qualify.
Mhm. Um, I think this might be an appropriate point to mention to our listeners that one of our upcoming guests in season 2 is architect Pascal Sablon of Adjay Associates. So Pascal is also the founder of Beyond the Built Environment, and her work on social justice and design was one of the reasons that she was awarded the 2021 Whitney Young Jr. Award by the AIA. So subscribe to the American Building podcast so you don't miss any of the spectacular episodes like this one or the one coming up with Pascal. So I had the opportunity I was a tour guide at MIT and I had the opportunity to give a tour of the campus to the family of IMPay because one of his family members was actually my classmate. So siblings of IMPay, extended family members of a large group. And I believe because I was a course for architecture undergrad, I was the guy that was selected to take them around. So during the course of the project, you've become much more familiar with the legacy of IMPay and him as a person. So, what would you say are your strongest impressions of him now at this point in your design process?
Well, so first of all, this I have an obsession with pay that dates back well before winning this building, which I think
Okay.
showed up in our response to the raw call. My wife and I, when we first uh, um, our first apartment was in Kips Bay Towers, which is a pay project,
Mhm.
and this relates back to what I was talking about earlier in my own experience and the experience of many others who are not part of the dominant culture. Harry Cobb was a friend of mine, and I used to ask him about this, and it was a different generation, so I think it was a little harder to talk about. But Pei famously, you know, Pei did his urban planning work. He worked he worked as the house architect in a development firm for Bill Zeckendorf.
Mhm.
Um, I would have to imagine that when Pei was coming of age and coming out of Cambridge, that he was not easily accepted amongst white shoe architecture firms as their next, great designer,
Uh,
right? And usually, I mean, even a place like SOM, you had partners like Imran Khan, but they were structural engineers. Like it was, or there was always this notion that design was meant for the blue bloods, right? And I.M. Pei might have been a blue blood in the Chinese context, but not
Mhm.
in the American context. Um, so what are my impressions of Pei? That he was an extraordinarily agile, nimble thinker that brought to the rigidities of modernism a certain sense of whimsy along with order.
Mhm.
Uh, and the Rock Hall, which is sort of late Pei, you really, really feel this. There are moves, especially on the lake side of the building, that show a master architect um, with a great sense of license and belief in himself to make these free, non-orthogonal, non-geometric kind of well, not non-geometric, but non-rigid kind of design moves
Mhm.
that show his own confidence in himself. Um, you know, Pei was obviously famously like a consummate gentleman. I've never heard anyone speak an ill word of him.
Mhm.
Always, kind of the soft-spoken but diehard, getting what he wants kind of architect. Uh, it's funny. I'm reading this book, "The House the Rock Built." That's the history of that building, and Pei was selected by the chair of the board of the New York Foundation of the Rock Hall, who was also the founder of Rolling Stone. And there's this thing about, well, I.M. Pei also stood. There was I guess there was a kind of colloquialism with pay that I am pay could also translate to you will pay, because the buildings will go over budget and so forth, which I had never heard and I thought was really funny.
That's
Uh,
hilarious.
um, we don't have enough figures like Pay anymore. We don't have enough figures like Norman Foster anymore. We don't, people who Norman Foster was at COP26. He did a breakfast with John Kerry and mayors from around the world, like these people again who can think so precisely about design and aesthetics and material logic and structural logic and then expand their world out. Hey, I don't know if while you were at MIT and while you were giving the family the tour, if you saw Pei's thesis from MIT.
Is it in the Roach Library?
Uh, yes, and it is worth looking up.
Okay.
It is much more radical than you might expect from what feels like a career of an establishment architect. Um, so I hope a lot more is written about him over time. I don't think we fully understand the man. Uh, I do a lot of photography, and the famous French photographer Henri Cartier-Bresson is someone who's very influential for me. And there was a show at MoMA called that was about Cartier-Bresson's early work and his the influence he both felt and had on the surrealist movement. And Cartier-Bresson goes on to become one of the world's most sort of establishment photographers in the way that Pei is an establishment architect. But I think just a millimeter under the surface, there's a much, much more complex individual there. And I think Pei is of that same ilk.
Mhm. So then, in terms of being able to understand someone that is um, different at heart than perhaps anyone else of his contemporaries, you talked about um, reading a book in history of his. You talked about visiting his building and understanding it in the context of where it's located. Were there any other tools that you had at your disposal in understanding the designer and his intent in
the iteration of that building that you're now working on?
Abby getting dressed in the dressing area he designed in our little apartment in Kips Bay,
Of
which
course, you're right,
sure
yeah.
which I'm sure Pei designed, like, with like, I think those are just literally his apartments.
Mhm.
A one-bedroom has a foyer, it has a dressing area.
Mhm.
It's it's so civilized,
Mhm.
and there's this way in which Pei defined space, so you understood that even though it was an open plan setting, there was this area that had a sense of privacy where you got dressed. And it's amazing how much we lost this in like apartment design. But the larger point is, um, he has a strategy for defining, in other words, it is not the Miesian kind of uh, liquid space where, space is flowing in every direction,
Mhm.
broken, undefined, infinite. Pei's spaces tend to be quite finite.
Mhm.
And they do, of course, dance with each other in this way that, breaks them open and gives them fluidity, but not in a Miesian way. And in fact, it like again, if there's any, to me, the predecessor of Pei is Khan, because Khan also tends to work with finite volumes of space,
Mhm.
and so that is a big influence for us. We've thought about this issue a great deal and how much we're going to play the pay game versus the pow game
Mhm.
of again, how do we be reverent to this great architect, but irreverent in the sense that it is a different moment, a different time, uh, in a musical genre that has rapidly evolved. The current chair of the Rock Hall, when you induct Jay-Z and Todd Rundgren and LL Cool J and Carole King
Yep.
all at the same time, people might rightfully ask, well, what is this rock?
What is the museum of? Yeah.
And, like rock and roll, if you define it that broadly, right? Uh, and Dave Chappelle, when he introduced Jay-Z, said, it's great that Jay-Z's being inducted, but you have to understand he belongs to us. When he said that, I realized part of what he was saying was an assertion about the fact that, rock and roll
Yeah.
had historically been too often understood as a white genre.
Mhm.
That's what he was saying. And he was saying, like, look, for to Dave Chappelle, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically saying Jay-Z is hip hop before he's rock and roll in all circumstances. And I get that. But what the current chair of the Rock Hall Foundation says is that what rock uh, it is what moves the spirit of young America.
Mhm.
And that is, and it's interesting because you've chosen to use the word American in your podcast. And I'm really glad, and there are people in my office who are like, Spirit of Young America. I mean, at this point, isn't rock and roll? Rock and roll is this international genre. Why would it just be the spirit of young America? And again, there's the British invasion, and like, how can you possibly? But I do think that for this young country, it is important if we're going to hang together and be a country, which is a big question mark right now,
Mhm.
that we need cultural anchors. We need cultural definition that says this is who we are. And that doesn't mean that it's not simultaneously international, but there are things that ground us, you know, as Americans. Um, and look, I'm an immigrant. I was born in Calcutta. You always feel like the only place you're ever truly welcome is on an airplane. Um, right? Like, you show up
Everywhere and nowhere at the same time.
right. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you show up in India with the American accent. It's like, who's this guy? You show up here and they're like, anyway. Um, but, but I mean, I certainly feel very at home with rock and roll.
Mhm.
And there's that great movie about I think he's Pakistani, who like and Bruce Springsteen like gets him through life. He's like a Londoner, a young Londoner, and like Bruce Springsteen. And he like Blinded by the Light, that's the name of the movie. Anyway, the my point is just that to say that rock is about the spirit of young America, I think is critically important because what it's saying is that whether it's Jay-Z or much newer artists or much older legacy artists, that the continuum, the through line is about this way in which youth change the culture. And America is a place that has a history of the youth changing culture and demanding things of the establishment
Mhm.
that creates very, very high speed evolution. And that is something that is endemic to this country, but is spreading. I mean, I think when you look at like the gay rights decision in the Indian courts, that's coming out of an American sense of activism that is now very alive in a country like India. And so, and certainly the climate movement is all about this. Youth activism is critical. And so, um, I really like this. I really like this notion that the building now has to be this channel, this conduit for the spirit of young America. And that brings into question, is it a series of finite established forms that Pei was so fond of? And is that really the right formal language for the spirit of young America?
Mhm.
And that's the question mark that we are heavily into right now.
I think what's so fascinating, what you described as this inspiration for your firm and the way that you approach projects in terms of jobs, justice, and joy, is something that is so in its collection, so uniquely American. This idea that through hard work you gain freedom, and you're able to have the ability to start anew anything that you want in this country. The traditional idea of America, this idea that despite X, Y, Z, you can pursue your dreams. Here are the founding ideas of our country. And this idea that America does things just a little bit differently than the rest of the world, which often is a reason for joy for a lot of people. So I feel like this what you kind of described is this America in a nutshell, the America in its purest distilled form.
As a set of ideas. I mean, the problem is that so many things are broken.
Of course.
The equal opportunity in the education system, the housing system, the healthcare system, the transit system, that's all broken.
Mhm.
The idea that, I mean, even capitalism, pure capitalism means that you pay for your negative externalities. You pollute a river, you clean up the river,
Mhm.
right? So the fossil fuel companies and the fossil fuel subsidies and the fossil fuel lobbyists, we don't have pure capitalism. We have a completely warped form of capitalism that allows that to happen. So my point is, yes, those things that you all stated, those are things I celebrate as well. I mean, my parents came here with $32 and look
Mhm.
at us today, right? Like you know, but the thing is that as immigrants, especially, it's incredibly important to not get lulled into the narrative of the American dream without understanding all that's wrong with it, all that's it's doing to fail people instead of empower people. And so, um, to me, like, I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Mhm.
Right. Like, so, you know, it's like reading about Jefferson and your mind just gets blown. This guy that was so
Or
important.
is a rapist and a slave owner, a lot of other bad things too.
Right, but also the establishment of a lot of the enlightenment principles that you just, espoused, and so, you have to deal with this constant sense of contradiction,
Yes.
right? And so when you say things like, "This is the American Building Podcast," "The Rock Hall channels the spirit of young America," um, you can't just hold up the flag as this rah-rah thing without acknowledging those contradictions. At the same time, we can't cede the flag to the fascists who will claim that it is theirs, and only they are patriots, and so forth. So that to me is the challenge. That's the mix that we are all in. And architecture is the manifestation of that. And an architecture about a rock and roll hall of fame is really the manifestation of that. And so it's an exciting moment if you're willing to kind of grab the uncertainty of this time.
Let me ask you this then. Given all of the complexities, the values, and the needs that are going into this building and its renovation, how would you want IMPay to react to your renovation? If you had the opportunity to walk in through your work when you're done.
Boy, that's a tough one. Um, and it's hard. I mean, I wonder how his family will feel about it. Um, we are trying our best to honor his legacy while understanding that the building, the genre of rock and roll, the times we live in have moved past that moment.
Mhm.
Um, these things are terribly hard. I was asked to speak years ago at the Sydney Opera House. And it was one of the most moving things I've ever had to do. I could barely get through the talk. I was very emotional about it. And when you go there and you realize that Jornitsa never saw the completed building and that it was completed on his behalf, in some like in some things were absolutely brilliant, like a lot of what Overup did as the engineer was absolutely brilliant. Other things that, like, the local chapter of, their equivalent of the AIA, completed, the base of the building, really tough. Um, these things are hard, and, you know, but we, um so one of our first projects of housed the Domino Sugar Refinery, and that was not designed by a famous person, but it's a landmark, it's a heritage building, and,
Mhm.
palimpsest you know, I think is one of the most important things we can explore as architects today.
Mhm.
Everything's a palimpsest because there's layers of history everywhere. There is no tabula rasa.
Mhm.
And this is why, of course, again, people love working out in those desert sites. But even those desert sites have no tabula rasa. There's a climate. There's indentured slaves as workers. There's a context. There's always a context. And so we, this sense that working with a historical artifact, whether it's a landmark or a
Mhm.
building designed by a very famous architect, and how you layer, as opposed to just, again, that myth of the solo artist conjuring the object out of thing, to me is first of all, it's harder. It's what I like to say is more sauce for the goose. There's junks like like there is no sport in just going and playing, on an empty field. My grandfather always used to tell me that you should never play chess with someone who's worse than you. And so right, so when you're playing chess against the context of a site, a famous architect, incredibly rich musical genre, this is what you're playing chess with. And, like, that's only gonna tune your mind and challenge you and try to make you better as opposed to just this thing where some sheikh says, "Build me an icon out in the desert." That really gonna
And you birth this icon.
wait, I mean, is that really gonna challenge your mind that much when there's so little pushing against you?
Mhm.
All you have pushing against you is yourself at that moment, and that is, to me, not a terribly attractive thought.
I think that's a wonderfully appropriate perspective to take to produce something that is going to be iconically beautiful as well as respectful of the legendary architect that prepared the original building. Um, so thank you so much for joining us today on the American Building Podcast. If you want to hear the behind the scenes stories of how iconic buildings in our country were designed and built, subscribe to this podcast on Spotify, iTunes, Google, Anchor, Stitcher, or wherever you like to listen. And please rate and review on iTunes so we can reach a wider audience. We all know real estate is a tough industry to make it. So, how can professionals stand out and make a name for themselves in today's world? You can hear from me, the team, and Michael Graves, and many of our spectacular guests like Bishan on what we did to make it where we are. grab our exclusive guide, 7 Tips on How to Stand Out in Your Field at AmericanBuildingPodcast.com. Finally, we live in the richest country in the history of humankind, and we must reach out beyond the boundaries that we see and the boundaries that we create in order to help build homes and communities. Today, Vishaan and I have made donations to the Architectural League of New York, which advocates for architecture as a profession. I encourage you, our listeners, to support their worthwhile work as well. My name is Atif Kader, and this has been American Building by Michael Graves. Thank you so much for a wonderfully, wonderfully, lovely, interesting, thought provoking conversation. I sincerely appreciate your time.
Thanks, Atif. It's been really a joy.
I'm Atif Kader, and thanks for joining me on American Building. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite listening app and leave a rating and review. America's housing crisis is one of our greatest challenges, but what are the real solutions? Hear from the developers and other industry experts driving meaningful change. Get our exclusive guide, Housing in America, 8 Ways We Can Solve Our Way Out of a Crisis at AmericanBuildingPodcast.com.